is it literally the case that we might be the microcosm of the cosmos?
It's very literally true. When you gaze upon the night sky and you're dazzled by the stars, the very eye that sees the stars is composed of molecules that were forged in the furnaces of those very stars. In that burning core of nuclear fusion, there is a portal between levels of reality, the physical universe and a parallel universe. And the stars mediate that interface.
Maybe one could ask the question, what is the purpose of cosmology in the first place?
This world has been brought forth in order that the hidden mystery could be revealed, that love could encounter beauty. We're just an expression of something far vaster than ourselves that is revealing itself. And once one discovers that tide, the pull is ineluctable. There's no turning back. Life becomes the adventure of that unfoldment.
This episode is a deep dive into the theme of spiritual cosmology, where we look at fundamental questions about the creation of the universe, or perhaps even multiverses, and how this multiplicity emanates out of unity or God, or what in quantum physics they would call the zero-point energy field. We also look at questions of what kind of worlds emanate out of this unity and what kind of beings inhabit those worlds and how they're all interconnected with each other and the unity. And lastly, what is the point of it all? So in previous episodes, we have looked at the spiritual cosmologies through the lens of the traditions of Kashmir Shaivism or Tantric Shaivism, and also the tradition of Tibetan Bon Buddhism. However, I feel like there is another tradition with a profound and rich spiritual cosmology, and that is the tradition of Sufism, the mystical dimension of Islam, and the Abrahamic traditions. So to help us navigate the landscape of Sufism, it is my honor to have with me today one of my dear teachers, Pir Zia Inayat Khan, who is a scholar of religion and a teacher of Sufism in the universalist lineage of his legendary grandfather, Hazrat Inayat Khan. Pir Zia has also written several books, including Immortality, A Traveler's Guide, and Mingled Waters, Sufism, and the Mystical Unity of Religions. So this episode is a deep dive, and I hope that you'll enjoy it. And if you do so, kindly share it with your friends. And thank you. So welcome, Pir Zia.
Thank you so much, Kenan Azam Khan. Wonderful to be with you here today.
It's a really honor and privilege for me. So Pir Zia, before we were talking, Sufism is such a broad subject and terrain. And I thought maybe we could explore a little bit about the Sufi cosmology. And because what I feel is that in the landscape today, there's a lot of information in the podcast arena about Tantra, the cosmology of Tantra or yoga, but less conversation on the very rich alchemical cosmology of Sufism. So perhaps we could start there.
Certainly, let's talk about it.
So I understand from the way I look at cosmology is one way is to look at cosmology in a very objective manner. And that takes us to the arena of science. So we look at the planets and the stars and beyond, the galaxies and so on. But in the spiritual traditions, it seems that there is a cosmology refers to a more predominantly subjective way of exploration, so to speak. So maybe I can check with you first. How would you say that this is accurate, or would you like to say something about it?
Yes, I think it is accurate. And to speak of subjectivity doesn't necessarily mean irrationality, but it does mean that the observer or the scientist acknowledges himself or herself as a constituent of what is being observed, which is to say that the very act of observing any phenomenon puts the observer in relationship with what's being observed, and that relationship has to be acknowledged at the outset. Certainly, this was true for the alchemists, who, when working on a substance to transform the substance, were also aware that they were transforming themselves in the process.
Yes. And what would be the purpose of such transformation?
The purpose of the transformation would be a clarification and integration of what is already within us, but within us in a state of potentiality or dormancy. So this means that we are, as human beings, microcosms of the whole cosmos. But the cosmos isn't yet fully realized in us. There's a chaos within us that needs the activation that will bring it into cosmic proportions so that, in fact, the totality can emerge in our own consciousness.
Wow, that really sounds profound. So, when you say that we are a microcosm of the macrocosm, if I may ask, would this be an analogy or metaphor, or would it go to the point of a literal? Is it literally the case that we might be the microcosm of the cosmos?
It's very literally true. If you consider the fact that when you gaze upon the night sky and you're dazzled by the stars, the very eye that sees the stars is composed of molecules that were forged in the furnaces of those very stars.
Yes. So it's the stars themselves are reflecting or looking upon themselves in a way. Yes. So it's quite profound. And in objective cosmology, if I may say, or in science, when we want to experience a planet or any destination, we develop technologies that are like cars or planes and rockets. What you just shared, out of my own curiosity, it opens up this possibility that I've been contemplating about other modes of travel, which might hint, if it's already the case that we're the microcosm, then there could be an alternative way also to travel, which could be subjective or perhaps a combination of objective exploration, as in science, and the subjective exploration, as you described. Do you think that such a possibility exists in our future, or has been done historically in the past?
It certainly has been done. There was a tradition of mounting the staircase of the planets. And in fact, the great Chishti theorist Masood Bek, who lived in, I think, the 14th century in Delhi, when he speaks of sama being the ritual of musical audition, he says that the purpose of sama is to wend a path through the planets and the stars, and that the musical modes that are employed bring to the consciousness of the Sufi in Sama the signature of each of the planets. And so an ascent is made.
Wow. So in this experience, if one has that experience, would there be still a reason for, let's say, having a spaceship or another device that could take you to that place? Or will, in its essence, it already accomplishes the goal of travel?
Yes, the question of space travel is an interesting one. And my response here would be to say that if there is an intention to explore off-world, to move off-world, the first responsibility would be to ask ourselves, what have we done on this planet Earth? What have we done to this planet Earth before we go and settle other planets? Because we're going to bring the same consciousness, we're going to bring the same way of life to whatever planet we approach. And this is our home. This planet Earth is the core of who we are physically as human beings, and also essential to other deeper dimensions of our existence. And entering into a right relationship with our home planet, to me, would seem imperative prior to any consideration of settling elsewhere.
Yes, because it definitely seems like that the current interest in exploration and going to other places is primarily driven by the fear of what we have done to our current ecology,
Exactly.
which probably is not the best motivation to go elsewhere.
That's right.
Um, so you already touched on this question that I'm about to ask you, but in terms of cosmology, um, before we go into what the cosmology of Sufism entail, maybe maybe one could ask the question: what is the purpose of cosmology in the first place, or the purpose of the cosmos? So maybe you could say something about, in the Sufi view, what purpose does the cosmos or creation serve?
Well, I'm reminded of a story, which is the story of my grandfather, Hazrat Pir Murshid Inayat Khan, as a boy in India, growing up in an Orthodox Muslim family and learning to practice the daily prayers, and indeed practicing the 5 daily prayers every day dutifully. But then reaching an age when he began to wonder, why is it? What is the purpose of this practice? We all do it because we're expected to do it, but the practice is one in which we're reaching out to Allah, reaching out to God, but where is Allah? Who is Allah? I have no inkling. And this prayer has the appearance of just a performance, but what's really at the heart of it? And he said, unless I know that, how can I go on? And he went and spoke with his grandfather, Mullah Baksha, was very wise. And instead of chastising him, Mullah Baksh said, he pointed to a verse in the Quran. And he said, see here where it says, we shall show them our signs on the horizons and in themselves, and they will know that we are Allah. And from that day, Hazrat said, it was like an initiation. His eyes were opened and he saw that there was a quest to be undertaken, the quest to find Allah, to discover the source of this whole universe. And the whole universe exhibited all of the necessary signs, but the signs had to be studied, had to be pursued. And the signs were to be found on the horizons, which means in nature, in the cosmos, but also in themselves, turning within, closing the senses, and finding the signs that are there in the depths of one's own consciousness. He realized from this indication that this was his life's work, and really the life's work of anyone who awakens to the reason for our being alive.
Yes, this inner and outer exploration seem to be tied paradoxically. One is, at least in my experience, it seems like it's very deeply connected. One constantly leads to the other.
Yeah. And they mirror each other, don't they? The inner exploration shows you the world, and the world shows you your inner being.
Mm-hmm. So, in Indian cosmology, I was speaking before, there are planetary beings for each of the planet. There are many, many deities, countless perhaps, and uh, each deity serves different purposes, and it's like a ladder that goes up to the very source of creation. And in the sort of a spiritual country or spiritual domain, the residents want to connect with these deities or these other beings, and somehow that is related with the harmony of our life here as humans. So perhaps we could, is there an equivalency or parallel to say in Sufism of all of these hierarchy of beings, so to speak?
Yeah. Well, the great astronomer Kepler was very interested in the music of the solar system and found that each planet has a tone, and together the planets in their circlings make a symphony. And he was able to actually track its cadences. And this is one way of expressing you might say, the personality of each planet. Another approach to the subject was made by a Mazdian uh, sheikh known as Zul Ulum Azar Kaivan, who lived in the time of Akbar in India. He came from Iran and settled in India. And in his poems, he describes his inner ascension, in which he traveled through the spheres, and in each sphere encountered the spirits of that realm. And for each planet, the spirits had a particular character and pursued vocations that were particular to that planetary sphere. So, for instance, Saturn is a very occult sphere, and it was before the modern telescopes, it was the farthest visible celestial object. So it's seen as lying in the darkness, and it is, relatively speaking, far from the sun. And so it's the planetary sphere that embodies melancholia, kind of inwardness and dark introspection, which has its symptoms which can reflect even certain kinds of mental illness, but also it's a mystical planet, because that very ability to enter into the darkness, to be alone and to be alone with the alone, lends itself to esoteric knowledge of a certain kind. So that's what Azar Kaivan discovered when he visited Saturn, that there are spirits who had this character. There were magi and soothsayers who were Saturnian in their way. And they brought him, he said, they brought him to meet the angelic intelligence of Saturn, the very spirit of the planet itself. So you might say that it's something like a beehive, where there's a queen, and there are all of the bees that support the queen and take direction from the queen. So there's a central intelligence to each planet, but there are also all of these entities that are of that nature, that are affiliated. And so that's what he experienced in each of the planets in turn, and finally made his way through this solar system into the stars.
Fascinating. And will that also be the case for Earth, where we are today?
Yeah, yeah. So the interesting thing is that so often, now it isn't always the case, and certainly this is not so among indigenous traditions that have remained very rooted in the earth, but among the stargazing traditions, sometimes there's been a tendency to forget that Earth too is a planet. Looks up in the heavens and one witnesses these bright planets that clearly reveal an archangelic or an angelic intelligence to a keen observer, an observer who isn't only, let's say, objective in the sense of excluding him or herself from the experience, but someone who brings their own soul to the encounter is going to find you're meeting a soul in that celestial object. But the tendency, and this goes back to Sumer actually, there's a tendency to glorify what you see in the night sky, and conversely to denigrate what's under your feet, forgetting that the Earth itself is a luminous planet. And just as the moon glows when we look out into the night sky and gaze on the moon, the Earth also has its glow that you could see by standing on the moon. Earth light.
Wow, yes. Um, I'm just wondering, as we go beyond the planets, for example, there's the zodiac and there are stars, and you were just talking about that. Often, when you look at the planets, we can forget about the Earth. Is there an influence that decreases as we go further out into space, or increases, or if that's even the correct way of looking at this?
An influence. You mean the influence of the Earth itself?
Yes, what you just said also prompts in my mind that it's pretty obvious, even if one was full on materialist, that the moon and the sun have we have our circadian rhythms, and so many things from the gestation in the womb, countless things that we can find genetic markers for that show this connection of the microcosm and macrocosm that you were speaking of. It becomes less so when we go into the planets, and we perhaps in our current culture we doubt as we go further out. Uh, but at least to me, it's as you were saying, it's like a reflection or mirroring. Where does it stop, or does the influence change, or this goes into
Yeah. That's an interesting question.
Yes.
Yeah, that is an interesting question. Well, in today's world, and in fact, it's been so for centuries and centuries, people migrate frequently. People move from land to land, and there's one kind of spiritual experience that's possible for those who remain deeply rooted in one place and are, so to speak, autochthonous. That's the word. They are of the clay of that place for generation after generation. They know its soil. They're closely acquainted with the trees of the place and the streams of that place. And there's something in them that's of that land. There are others who are nomads, and they move from place to place, and their character is more attuned to the pathways that they travel, the routes they follow, sometimes migrating with the seasons. So there are different characteristics in the very, let's say, etheric body of human beings, depending on their way of life, the more rooted ones being autochthonous to a location that puts them in touch also directly with the native etheric spirits of that place, Orionids mostly. And then others who are, because of their mobility, more likely to enter into an association. If they're going to be in contact with inner worlds, it's more likely going to be what we call an association on the astral plane. That is to say, not etheric beings who are mostly connected with a particular physical place, but beings who could show up one day in Paris and the next day in Richmond. So there's an ecology of relationship that comes depending on one's mobility. And if one were to travel beyond the Earth itself, this would certainly come into play, because here on Earth, we're all enfolded within Earth's atmosphere. And we don't necessarily realize the extent to which we are Earthlings. We really are Earthlings. We think of ourselves as, these autonomous selves that we're, responsible for our own thoughts. The weather is something that's happening externally, but actually we're not aware of the way in which the weather externalizes currents that are flowing in our own etheric bodies and in our minds, and vice versa, the ways in which our thoughts and emotions and attitudes are very much a reflection of geological realities and also living communities that include animals, plants, and invisible terrestrial beings of various kinds. So we're Earthlings, and we're enclosed within the atmosphere of the Earth. But if we were to travel to another planet within the solar system, that would be attenuated to some good extent. It would be superseded by the planetary character and community of that place. But we would remain within the envelope of the heliosphere, which is to say the Earth has its own atmosphere, and the Sun has an atmosphere that encompasses the planets and which filters out certain kinds of stellar influences. It's a kind of habitat for the planets within this circumference. And then there's a stall in that force, and outside of that, then there's the interstellar medium. And to venture there would be to be exposed to very different influences, because the Sun is a star among many stars, but just as the planets each have their own characters, the stars also have their own characters. And we may not be fully aware of the extent to which we're not only Earthlings, but we're Sunlings.
Yes, that almost seems like there's a whole domain of knowledge that we need to be aware of and consider if we are going to leave the planet. And a lot of these things are not really considered in contemporary astronomy. Um, Earlier, you were saying that you were mentioning Azar K1, and that in his exploration, he experienced the music. I wonder if that was the word you used, or the vibration of each planet.
Yeah, well, he said that sometimes the spirits of certain planets were musicians, especially Venus. Venus is the planet where the arts are dominant. But the one who really emphasized the musical character of the planets was Masudbek, when he spoke of Sama as a interplanetary voyage. And then in Western science, that thread is picked up by Kepler.
In this case, comparatively from my understanding of Indic or yogic philosophy, each deity comes with a mantra. And often it says that the mantra is the body of the deity, or it is the deity itself. So it almost seems like something very similar to what you were saying, that that's one perhaps way to experience the being of a place or a planet.
Yeah, yeah. For instance, we spoke about Saturn. The divine name in Arabic associated with Saturn is Rab, Rab, which means the sovereign. And someone might wonder why that name in particular. Why is Saturn associated with Rab? And alchemically, Saturn is associated with the stage of Nigredo, which is the experience of darkening, going into the depths of darkness and unknowing. and shedding a lot of assumptions and expectations and biases, and finding oneself in a state of bewildering transcendence. And there, the only anchor is this sense of belonging to something that one can no longer describe or define. And yet the belonging is there, this sense of an allegiance, of a root in a reality that is older than this world. And that's expressed by this sense of Rabb. Alastu bi Rabbikum. That was the first question the soul was asked. Alastu bi Rabbikum. Am I not your Rabb? Am I not the sovereign of your soul? Am I not the one to whom you belong? Everything else falls away in Negredo, and what remains is that sense of the Rabb.
So there is, it seems to me, is there an experience to the word rub apart from, because at this level I'm just pronouncing it, but my understanding is that this there's a deeper embodiment of this word, phrase, or vibration.
Yeah, yeah. So when we work with the Asmal Husna, the divine names, it's good to know the meaning of the name, but also to hold one's understanding of that meaning lightly, because otherwise one finds oneself in a box. One has this notion of what it's all about, what it means, and that results in closure rather than an opening to the mystery. So to have a sense of the meaning of the name, but also to know that one's idea of that meaning is just a pale reflection of the reality itself. So how do you approach the reality? It's not just thinking hard about that meaning. It's opening up to it by not thinking in a way and repeating the name. That's why mantra yoga, or Sufism we say wazifa, taking up a name, being given that name, practicing it, repeating it daily, takes one into a state where you're not just thinking about it, but that name is looming close and overwhelming you and filling you and pervading you and speaking its own mystery through you.
So maybe exploring further into this domain, I'm going to refer to one of the lovely books of Hazrat Inayat Khan that I actually fell in love with, which was The Soul Whence and Whither. And you have written a beautiful commentary with a lot of exercises related to that book in Immortality, the Traveler's Guide. And in that book, what touched me coming from an academic background and as started to enter into this spiritual path of this new sort of cosmology of the soul, of my own journey of where it begins and where it ends. And I'm wondering perhaps we could enter into that journey from the Sufi perspective. Of course, the Indian yogic path has a similar or its own trajectory of reincarnation of the soul and how you come to this realm and where you are to go, which often is completely, we don't have that longer arc of life in the West.
Yeah, yeah, that's right. Well, that is a very important work of my grandfather's, and for me it's been a lifelong study. In it, he describes what he calls the soul's journey, although at the end he problematizes the very idea of a journey, because a journey means that something begins somewhere and it goes forth, and in this case, the conception is that it comes ultimately back to the place from which it began. And there's some relative truth to this. Certainly, relatively speaking, it's quite true. But the idea of the soul going forth also misses something, which is that actually the whole journey is taking place within the soul. The soul isn't a thing that's moving through time and space. It's the container for the whole experience. So he ends up saying it's a journey in fact, but not a journey in truth. But in this, shall we say, journey, relatively speaking, there are two phases, basically. And the first phase he calls involution, and the second, evolution. So, evolution, from this perspective, is only the second half of the story. The first half of the story, which leads up to where we find ourselves today, isn't the story of evolution, it's the story of involution. So that seems to run counter to the assumption that our status as a modern human being is a kind of pinnacle that represents the summation of a process of unfoldment where reality is revealing itself and arriving at a watershed in which it becomes self-aware. And there's something to this, but the reverse is also true. And that is that, in fact, the process that leads up to our current state is an involution, which is to say, a process whereby the divine nature, which hitherto, and still on another dimension of reality, still to this day, existed in a limitless state, a state of totality and absoluteness, undergoes a process of veiling. And you might even describe it as a kind of contraction. In Kabbalah, they use the word tzimtzum. So one metaphor for creation is that, a luminous source, the divine source, projects itself. It emanates. That's the paradigm of emanation. In the way that the sun sends out its rays, the original source irradiates space and time. And that phenomenon comes into Murshid's, my grandfather's, cosmology at a certain point. But the larger perspective on this first phase of cosmogenesis is that it's more a process akin to tzimtzum, or a contraction of veiling. 70,000 veils of light and darkness. And that our status represents, let's say, a contraction of the totality, a reduction of consciousness. The normal scientific paradigm would stress ourselves as the pinnacle of evolving consciousness. But another way to look at it is actually consciousness existed in this limitless state and has contracted itself and has undertaken a veiled condition. But the benefit of that contraction and veiling is that it enables a certain perspective. From the perspective of Sufi metaphysics, this is called separation. And separation establishes the conditions that make a reunion possible. And certainly that make love possible, because if there's absolute union, there's no differentiation, there's no distance, and there's no space in which love could arise.
I have lots of quick questions. Thank you. You said Simsum in Kabbalah. Does that have any connection with sesame, like when we say open sesame?
That's interesting. It might. I don't know.
Okay. It just brought in my mind from that, I think the Tales of Aladdin, or Arabian Nights, I'm not sure, where the cave opens when you say open sesame. The other, you mentioned 70,000 whales. That also connected with with me in the sense of the yoga. We have the pranic nadis, the channels, and I don't know if it's exactly 70,000, but is there some parallel there?
Yeah, well, the veils are really the gradations of the planes of being, and one can categorize those planes according to any taxonomy. Sometimes the idea is I've heard 14 planes or 7 planes or 5 planes. It depends, where one draws the boundaries and what you accentuate. But if you really take in all of the nuances of all of the gradations of the process of incarnation, then you get up to a number like 70,000. It's a symbolic number. It means an enormous number. And it's veils of light and darkness, because light and darkness as contraries bring into relief the many facets of the manifest universe. This universe is born of contraries. And so there must be death if there's going to be birth. There's light and darkness. And this brings in also the question of theodicy and, how is it that suffering can be a constituent of a world that was brought into being by a benevolent source? How can it be that there is death? How can there be suffering and even the kind of evil that is so hard to countenance? How can this derive from a providential source? When we see that the universe comes into relief because of the interplay of opposites, that we see that to create this accommodation, there has to be this play of contraries, and that we as human beings emerging into a process of individuation, which begins in the innermost spheres and burgeons. The angels aren't yet so individuated, but the jinns are more so. They have still more discretion and agency. And that's why already, what we could call evil is starting to emerge at that level. And how in the human condition, we're really at a frontier where the opposites stand in such sharp relief. And this is, in a way, it's the culmination of that first phase of cosmogenesis, where the totality is concentrating its life in loci of agency, that is to say, creatures who more and more are able to take on an egoic identity. And that egoic identity is a framework that shuts out, so many dimensions of reality. It's so enclosed, but in its very enclosure, it confronts the duality of a manifest universe born of the interplay of the opposites, and it becomes a space in which the opposites can enter into a dynamic interplay and synthesis that will bring the cosmos into a further dimension of integration and realization and dispensation of divine creativity.
Yeah, thank you so much. Uh, maybe to go into a little bit the theme that as you're describing, you mentioned the word jinn and angels, and this is in the cosmology presented by Hazrat Inayat Khan, and I'm wondering if you could describe a little bit of what each of those are.
Yeah. So we ourselves as human beings are interdimensional beings. We're not purely a physical phenomenon. We also have a mental substrate, that is to say, and I don't mean, of course, only the hard material of the brain, but I also mean what is functioning through the brain. It's still not understood in science, but consciousness, you can't locate it in the tissue of the brain, even though the brain is its medium. So there's a mental life that isn't equivalent to any physical structure. Some have proposed that maybe the electromagnetic activity in the brain is itself consciousness, and others would say, well, that's more of a epiphenomenon a phenomenon that has yet to be actually tracked. But we certainly experience it directly in our own self-reflexive awareness. We know that we're not only this visible body, we're a mind. And we also sense that beyond that mind, we're a soul. And when I use that word soul, I'm using it in the way that Hazrat Nair Khan used it. In psychology, oftentimes soul is used to refer to the mind itself, or the deeper, maybe unconscious level of the mind. But that's not the way that Hazrat Nair Khan used it. He used the word soul to refer to what in Indic thought is called the Atman, and in Sufism, the Ruh. So it's not a condition of the mind, it's prior to the mind, and its nature transcends thought. Its content isn't thought content. Its content is pure luminous awareness. So my grandfather used to make a distinction between intelligence and consciousness. Consciousness is the character of mental thought, but beyond that degree of perception, there's another kind of perception which in Sufism is called ilmi huzuri, which is to say presential knowledge, not representational. It doesn't entertain concepts and representations and ideas. It's sheer, direct presence, luminous knowing. It's the soul's own substance, you might say, as knowledge. Its knowledge isn't something it does. Its knowledge is what it is, its own luminosity. So that's really a description of the angelic condition. And they're beings who live only within that condition. They don't also have a mind and also have a body. We have a soul, but additionally the mind and the body. There's some beings that only live at the level of soul in that sphere called Jabarut. And then there are other beings that have begun their life as angels, but undergo, you might call it a migration, or you might call it a densification, a crystallization of their soul, whereby they enter Malakut, or the realm of mental world, the mental world. And so all of us who are human beings have, before our birth, lived in that sphere as mental beings. And that might not be something that one can immediately grasp, because one tends to think of the mind as a formation of this particular incarnation. That there's a tendency to look at the mind of a child as something that's emerging in their maturation, subsequent to, well, even in the prenatal state, following conception, that somehow a mind is growing, and that it had no prior existence. On the other hand, in-depth psychology and the work of Jung, for instance, there is this concept of a collective unconscious, and that seems a gesture toward this sense that there's an immersion in mental life that we're emerging out of in the individuality of our particular human incarnation. But there's already, between the state of pure soul, which is a profoundly abstract state, and incarnation itself and the burgeoning anatomy of the brain and the nervous system, that there's a passage through the inner experience of humanity, the crossroads where souls who have disincarnated, whose physical forms have dissolved, are progressing in their further journey into the beyond. So it's a crossroads where you might say angels are descending toward the horizon of the physical. Physical beings are in the post-mortem state, are navigating the hereafter. And it does help to explain why a child is born who, in some cases, very closely resembles the parents, not only resembles the parents physically, but also in personality, but also cases which are very different, where the child, let's say the parents had nothing to do with music for generation after generation, and suddenly that child is a musical prodigy. One way to explain that is, reincarnation. That's a subject I know that you're familiar with.
Yes, actually, interestingly, another thing that came to my mind was I did the oneness program with you, a day-long program,
Yeah.
and I would like to ask a few questions that are related. But you had actually talked in that program of the word in endosymbiosis, which
Oh, yeah.
I went back and did quite a bit of research
Oh, yeah.
because I was embedded in the biological computer science and biology in academia. So it just, you could say more about it, but this parallel of symbiosis of even the dimensions that you were speaking of, the genic and angelic, and how there is a continuous overlap and symbiosis. Maybe I'll pause there, but I also wanted to quickly mention um, what they now call epigenetics in biology. Because earlier, a few decades ago, it was again Darwinian evolution. There was no alternative, so they said, okay, your ancestors don't really impact you. But now it's becoming more and more acceptable that 3 generations ago, if something happened in your ancestral land, then that now what is happening in your life can be explained by that.
That's right. Yeah, that's true. There really are so many vectors that it's hard to account for anything novel. There are ancestral links, there are environmental links, both overt and covert. And then there's this phenomenon that Murshid is speaking about in The Soul Whence and Whither, which is not so much speaking in terms of reincarnation. He would explain reincarnation in this way, that what happens is that a soul that leaves the physical body takes with it its physical experiences, and it may well encounter a soul who's moving, so to speak, in the opposite direction, moving into incarnation. And so the two souls cross paths, and they both dynamize each other, they energize each other, because the soul that's coming from the physical world brings with it, the zest of what it means to be in the physical senses. And that fascinates a soul that has hitherto been purely living and moving in the angelic realm and just beginning to have a sense of form in the genic world. There's form, but not matter. So form without substance. And the idea that, that a form would wear weight is a novel one there. There's something very heavy from that perspective about this physical world. And it's both daunting to the spirits of the jinnic world. It looks too dense, almost claustrophobically so. But also, there's something fascinating about entering into a physical body and touching this dense earth with a footstep. And so there's something entrancing about it. But there are jinnic beings in Malakut, who are sort of just on that threshold. And then a soul comes along who has incarnated and is now returning to Malakut and says, I've been to this place there. There's this town. Something's going on in this town. This person lives there, and there's been this event, and there's a story going on. And that soul becomes interested. What would it mean to actually enter into that story? So two things are going on. One is that the soul who has disincarnated is giving a preview of events on Earth. And the other thing is that that soul who has disincarnated brings their own learnings. Maybe they became a poet on Earth, and they come and recite some poems. And now that soul on the verge of incarnation actually studies poesy for a while with that disincarnate soul, and then comes down and brings that knowledge. And when the child grows up, people think, what happened? Is this a reincarnation of that poet? But it was because there was some kind of transmission that happened in the inner worlds. So oftentimes, when we come to this world, we don't just come as a blank slate. We had our family in the inner world, and also we've met people, earthly, physical beings, even before getting here. So it's not so strange to arrive. It's like, oh yes, this is where I expected to be.
A quick question that comes to my mind in that regard is, before coming to this realm, in the genic or angelic realm, we might have a geography of that dimension. And I wonder how that will map, because sometimes we, as you were describing earlier in the conversation, uh, that if, astrologically speaking, somebody might have interests based on the conjunction that they were born in. Like somebody wants to go out and travel the cosmos, where somebody wants to really ground down and stay on Earth. And so I guess my question is around how could it be possible that in other realms we come from distant geographies, like this idea of, we're coming from different parts of the galaxy or the universe?
Yeah. Well, that's definitely true. And also, let's come back to endosymbionts in just a minute, because I realized I didn't follow up on what you said there. But regarding stellar ancestries, if you study the work of Ibn Sina, who is known in the West as Avicenna, you find that he is one of the first, I think the very first philosopher to begin to articulate the theory of the Alam al-Mithal, which is the world of images. And that's a way to speak about Malakut. It's a way to speak about this jinnic realm prior to incarnation. It's a barzakh. It's an interworld between the angelic world of pure light, luminous intelligence, and the physical world of substance. In between is this interworld called the Alam al-Mathal, the world of images. And Surawadi says that world is like the images that you see in a mirror. However, there's no glass. They're just floating. The images are floating. So a world of floating images, that describes the Alam al-Mithal. And when the body is relinquished, that's going to be our location. And so you could say that in the hereafter, we're left with our thoughts, we're left with our images. If there's certain images that we keep coming back to in our dreams, in our visions, That's what we'll be surrounded by. And even the image that we have of ourselves, what's your body going to look like? It's going to look like how you conceive yourself. So that's what you wear there. And now, how does this relate to the stars? Well, Avicenna suggested, and Suravati picked up on this, that the Alama Mithal transpires inside the stars, which is to suggest that in that burning core of nuclear fusion, there is a portal between levels of reality, the physical universe and a parallel universe. And the stars mediate that interface. And so from this perspective, you could say that, the stellar rays that bathe the Earth from the sun, but also the rays that descend through the heliosphere from proximate stars and even from other galaxies, carry with them something that comes from the other side of that portal, and are therefore tracks through which potentially souls moving into incarnation could follow.
This is such a fascinating topic, and I'm just there's different questions that come to me, and maybe you can just have a few brushstrokes. So one is, oftentimes there is also a possibility of portals in different geographical locations on planet considered, at least in the New Age, and also, every spiritual tradition seems to have places that often the word is used as portal, and sometimes, from what you're describing, there seems to be some parallels of like almost like an airport of sorts.
Yeah, there certainly are vortices, we could say, which is to say there are eddies in the etheric medium. So the physical world is constituted by the visible physical matter, but also the etheric substance. And that corresponds to, in ourselves, a body that underlies the physical body, but it isn't the jinnic body that we were just speaking of. That jinnic body, I would call the eidolon, and this body that is etheric that underlies the physical body, I would call it the diaphane, and it's called in Sufism the nasama, a breath body or a pranic body. So that nasama, that etheric body, has as its environment, has it as its ecology, the etheric dimension of the earth. And the etheric dimension of the earth certainly does correspond significantly with the visible contours. There is a close interrelationship between the visible and invisible dimensions, but they're not identical also. And so there are energetic currents that aren't going to be obviously evidenced by anything that our eyes can see, but which can be picked up by someone who's able to tune in a certain way. And those currents drew ancient human beings to congregate in certain places and to build shrines in certain places. And to this day, great sites of pilgrimage, and often actually the foundations of very dynamic cities, have their basis in these kinds of eddies and currents. Yeah, so we were talking just now about incarnation, the process of a soul. Not all souls do become incarnate. Well, it's not yet incarnate, but become active in the jinnic world. and take on a presence there. And then not all who become jinn go onward and take on a presence in the physical world. But all who are in the physical world have their counterparts, have their own presence on each of these in these preceding worlds. So that's, I think, an important principle to underscore, which is to say that nothing in this world is soulless, inanimate, without anima. Everything, whether it's a plant or a stone, has a ruh underlying it and has a nafs underlying it, and then has its jism, or its physical form. So there are souls that don't have a body, but there are no bodies that lack a soul. Now, how is it that a soul becomes a nafs, becomes a psychic entity, and a psychic entity becomes an embodied organism? Is it that the soul itself is transforming, densifying, congealing? That's one metaphor. You could say that the soul is like vapor that condenses to become liquid, and then the liquid freezes to become a physical body. That's one way of talking about it. But the thing is, even when the soul becomes embodied, it remains a soul. And even when we wear this body, we can turn within and enter into meditative states in which we absolutely identify with a vast domain, and one that certainly does transcend the contours of our physical form. So it's not that the soul condition belongs exclusively to the past and the soul has now become something dense. So how else can we think about it? Another way to think about it is to borrow from contemporary biology and to see that there are organisms within organisms, and that even the origin of the cells in our own bodies has its explanation in the way in which the early eukaryotic cell absorbed a microorganism that we today call the mitochondria, that is crucial to the functioning of our cellular life. And in the same way that early plant cells absorbed chloroplasts, which now do the work of harvesting the energy of the sun in the plant. So these are symbiotic relationships that are now internalized within the cell. And science is discovering more and more the ways in which innumerable organisms live in close mutual affiliations. And sometimes those affiliations are external, like a clownfish and an anemone living together. But sometimes they are internalized, where a larger organization harbors a smaller organism within it. And so this is endosymbiosis. And then you have to start thinking about meta beings, because when you realize that that larger being, in some cases, can't even survive without the embedded being within it, or vice versa, you see that in some ways they're functioning together as a coherent whole, as a single life form. And you could call that a meta-organism or a holobiont. And so you could see the relationship of the soul to the mind and the mind to the body as evidencing some of this dynamic, in the sense of the soul as the encompassing organism that welcomes in an organism that functions within it, and that is the mental life of the individual. And the meta-organism had a a prior life in which it hadn't yet involved itself within with this hosted organism, which is the mind. And there may come a time when that hosted organism dissolves away and still that vaster, older being subsists. But meanwhile, there's a mutuality that goes on, a mutual enrichment, and certainly that encompassing being in hosting the mind infuses it with the vitality that energizes its thought processes. But then within the mind itself, a still, shall we say, smaller organism finds its place, and that is the physical body. And it has a certain duration of life within the mind, but it isn't coeval. The mind had a prior existence and will live on beyond it in Malakut. But meanwhile, the mind animates the body, enhances its internal cohesion. All kinds of things happen when the interface between our consciousness and our physical organization begins to become strained. And when that's a tight-knit bond, there's certainly a benefit to the health of the body. So the body is certainly benefited from the mental constituent functioning through it. But also, what's an interesting subject, a very interesting subject, and this brings us from involution to evolution, is what is the way in which the body contributes something to the life of the mind, and then the mind contributes something through the heart to the life of the soul, and that even after those endosymbionts dissolve away, that most ancient organism is able to yield up the harvest of it all to that for which it itself serves a symbiotic purpose, and that is the cosmic being, which is the ancient Akli-Kul, and which is also known as the Nafsi-Kul and the Jismi-Kul. It's the overarching intelligence, overarching soul, which is also in its own incarnation the universal mind, and most tangibly, it's the body of the universe. And so how is it that our own uploading of the symbiotic relationship as it interfaces with every other symbiotic being in this lived experience to extract an experience of glorification that fulfills the very purpose of our incarnation? How is it that that glorification reverberates and enlivens the whole universe?
Yeah, in that regard, that's a very very deep point, as you're alluding, that we can return something even at the level of the cosmic being. But on the other hand, it also brings sort of a purpose to the project of the cosmos itself. That something is cultivated, which might be a mystery itself.
Yeah.
That the cosmic being rejoices in.
Yeah.
And on that note, may I ask you a question? Because in certain cosmologies, there is this idea of sort of a reboot, that the cosmos has everything spinning around something else, and this movement is happening, and at the end of time, there is a reboot, sort of, to use the language of the Matrix. The Matrix is rebooted.
Yeah. Well, there's a very important tradition in Sufism, a hadith Qudsi, and it said that these are words that were spoken by the divine voice to the prophet King David, Dawood alayhi salam. And the words are these: Kuntu kanzan makhfiyan fa'ahbabtu an urafa fakhalaqtu al-khalaq. I was a hidden treasure, and I longed to be known, and so created the world that I might be known. This world has been brought forth in order that the hidden mystery could be revealed, that love could encounter beauty, and that the treasury of the qualities of the divine, hidden away, unsensed, unheard, unfelt, unknown, would be discovered and glorified and experienced and embodied. And this is the motive force that runs through the lives of all of us. And so, our quest for awakening, our yearning for God, is not a happenstance. It isn't an accident. It's waking up to the purpose of it all. It's the dawning sense of the reason we have these two eyes, these two ears, this beating heart. There's a possibility here to awaken, and not only for our own sake. After all, who are we individually? We're just an expression of something far vaster than ourselves that is revealing itself. And once one discovers that tide, the pull is ineluctable. There's no turning back. Life becomes the adventure of that unfoldment. And yes, it has its cycles. And as you say, there's a reboot. Hazrat Knight Khan spoke of the out-breath of the universal being, and then the in-breath. It's that everything billows forth into manifestation, and then the breath, the cosmic breath, retracts and everything returns to its source. But that's not the end, because after every inhalation comes an exhalation, after every exhalation, inhalation. So there are cycle upon cycle, cosmos upon cosmos.
That's a question that comes to me in regards of my own sort of journey in this context, is that I find that pain is a part of human life, I feel like. And however, I find that there is a current of, the more I contemplate what you just shared, there is a current of enthusiasm that I feel will always be, curiosity and enthusiasm will always be present. And so part of me has started to surrender that will always be there. So there is a relaxation that I find, in spite of all the challenges that we have here, that um, I have to surrender to the curiosity and optimism. Do you have any thoughts on that?
Yes, curiosity is a good word. I always get worried if I find that I'm too sure of anything, and then thought freezes, feeling freezes. That's when the trance sets in, autopilot, routine. Something is dying. Life is continuous renewal, discovery. The Sufis say a tajalli is never repeated. That is to say, a dispensation of divine disclosure. It's never repeated. Each day is a new dawn, a new creation. And if one remembers this, how could one be bored, or how could one even suppose one had it all figured out? Because we're going to be dazzled all over again, day after day.
Hmm. Um, some some quick questions as you were describing this cosmology. Recently, in the West here, in the United States, there has been a lot of acceptance of um, unidentified flying objects, and the more acceptance of witnesses in this area, even from the military and other political spheres, and there is a relaxation because before it was a taboo. And in the context of our conversation, I'm just wondering that this is a sign of a changing sort of paradigm in a way, that something that was taboo is now more acceptable.
Yeah. Well, the presence of visitors in this physical world is so widely attested through history across cultures that there can't be any doubt about it. However, there's always a question of um, interpretation and framing and paradigm. And in a world in which the invisible realms have been shut out from serious consideration, in which only that which is quantifiable is taken seriously, and in which science often operates in a very reductive, materialist paradigm. When there are experiences of close encounters, that is to say, contact with unexpected beings, within our current mentality, there's always going to be a tendency to interpret it in purely physical terms and with reference to whatever technologies we're familiar with. And so, for instance, the carvings in South America have been interpreted as depicting space suits, and yet the depictions are seen as matching the technology of let's say a dozen years ago or more. And our own technologies, what space suits are going to look like 50 years from now is not what they looked like when we landed on the moon. But there's a tendency to interpret ancient evidence from the perspective of our own contemporary technology, and to believe that we find a confirmation there. So there's always going to be that tendency. But if we were to hold lightly the boundaries of our scientific paradigm and take seriously the noetic world and the imaginal world, angelic sphere, jinnic sphere, etheric sphere, then we wouldn't always have to interpret these encounters in terms of a spaceship, such as a NASA craft. One could see that in many cases, what we're talking about is an encounter with an angelic being or a jinnic being. And our new scientific paradigms and discoveries may actually help us to explicate what those beings, what their reality is. Certainly, the new mathematics presents an interesting perspective on multidimensional space, and how we can actually understand angels not merely as romanticized beings with fluffy wings and holding harps, but actually multi-dimensional entities who are present within our own immediate midst, but are not visible on account of the wavelength of our senses. So, in this sense, instead of the bottom line, I think, is rather than segregating two modes of reality and saying that traditional metaphysics belongs to an outmoded sphere that science has outpaced, and that if we're going to encounter unexpected beings now, we've got to think in terms of physical extraterrestrials. That's not fertile ground, but nor is it going to be profitable to dismiss all of the evidence of science and all of the mathematical and virtual reality findings that are on the horizon and retreat back into classical ideas about angels. We have to weave our world. We have to meet this moment with one eye trained on all that we're learning in the physical sciences and in the digital culture that's emerging. But if we somehow regard that as a departure from the inner experience of humanity over the last millennia, not only we're going to lose the possibility of staying true to the wisdom of the ages, but there's also just a host of experiential evidence to take very seriously, because the contemplatives of all ages have probed the inner worlds with great precision. And that body of knowledge actually has relevance to cognitive science and, and to cosmology in our time as well.
Absolutely. Like what you just shared reminded me of some of the people who, scientists who are celebrated today and had influenced a lot of the information age, such as Leibniz and Isaac Newton.
Yeah.
Those two come to mind. But interestingly, they were also alchemists.
Yeah.
And what is fascinating, nobody told me that when I was going to school as a kid, of all their alchemical works.
Yeah.
It's only recently that I've been surprised of Newton's body of work, which were alchemical, and also Leibniz. His first PhD thesis was actually combinatorics, but it was more Kabbalistic text. So yeah, it's interesting that would we, even though we celebrate them, we don't get to hear about those works.
Yeah, well, a lot of the figures that you mentioned and others too, many of the great thinkers of the Renaissance and even some of the major proponents of the Enlightenment, you describe them as alchemists or having roots in alchemy, and they belong to a larger tradition which is called Hermeticism, which is traced back to Hermes Trismegistus, who is identified in Islam as the prophet Idris, alayhi salam, Idris, and also Enoch, and who is seen as the founder of the sciences, and who was both a mystic and a scientist, and who therefore gives the impetus to the intersection between contemplative experience and science. And that interface manifests in the school of Alexandria and Panopolis, the Egyptian milieu that was influential in the early formation of Sufism. Zunnun, the early Sufi, had a background connected with this heritage. And it's a lineage that also links up the Western world and the Middle East, because texts move back and forth. It was, well, basically they moved westward. It was Western alchemical texts were translated into Latin and studied by Thomas Aquinas and others. And so it's that kind of lifeblood between cultures that links them up, and not only between the Middle East and Europe, but also the Hermetic current was important when intellectuals and spiritual thinkers in India were pointing out connections between Tantra and Islamic systems of knowledge. The Hermetic element was present there as well. So Hermeticism has tended to encourage interface between wisdom traditions, and certainly a marriage between religious and secular paradigms. And in Sufism, that heritage is in fact described as the sister of prophecy. So prophecy is understood, generally speaking, as a religious phenomenon, and it's tended within religious communities. Its legacy is tended within religious communities. But there's a sister to that, which is the Hermetic tradition, the alchemical tradition, and it runs parallel to the legacy of prophecy, and it provides an interface between prophecy and the sciences and the secular sphere. So that's what the space that Hermeticism has held for many centuries. And it's very important now that Hermeticism doesn't become consigned to medieval alchemy and to the alchemy of antiquity, as important as those periods were, but that its venture continues and connects up with the new biology, the new physics, and remains a bridge between those worlds. Because, when we really get in trouble, and sometimes, we see signs of that today, that we get in trouble when the secular and scientific world and the world of the sacred contemplative traditions, the heritage of prophecy, the religious communities, when those two worlds get out of sync, they're still influencing each other, but unconsciously instead of consciously. And we need to make that conversation conscious.
Yes, thank you for that. Just quickly, a quick example that came to me about this symbiosis, so to speak, between alchemy, Hermeticism, and modern sciences. A name that comes to mind is Giordano Bruno, that I've recently discovered, because he's considered to influence the metaverse, or the metaverse theory in quantum physics, and also a lot of the information age, artificial intelligence in particular. And it's quite fascinating that in Western science, it seemed like all the other stuff that he was talking about, or the experiments he was doing, was he just didn't know better, which was alchemy. But the influence, as you're saying, it's unconscious.
Yeah. So when it comes to Bruno, he was a proponent of the art of memory, which is really a technique that involves navigating the alamo methal, moving in the world of floating images, and learning how to move and employ images and meanings within that space, and organize that space. And the art of memory is a technique which became very elaborate, and he contributed to that system. And in the Sufi tradition, or in Tibetan Buddhist traditions and other traditions, there are comparable parallel methods of working in the alamo methal. And now you mentioned the metaverse. In many ways, this idea of a virtual space, not only the idea of it, the burgeoning reality of that space, is an extension of the alamo methal. It seeks to replicate the alamo methal. The problem there is that oftentimes the proponents of that enthusiastic adventure are oblivious to the fact that the alamo methal already exists. So there's sort of the assumption that a particular corporation is going to create a metaverse, Well, there already is a metaverse. There is a barzakh. It's there. And because of the materialistic bias, there's kind of an overexcitement that suddenly now we're breaking out of a purely material world and kind of breaking into a noetic world. Well, that's not the case at all. There already is a multiverse in which, in a barzakh, spirits are corporealized, bodies are spiritualized. There's an interface between pure intelligence and material existence. It's the crossroads in the migrations of souls through evolution and involution. So to deny all of that and somehow imagine that one is generating this space in a vacuum is very naive. And in fact, that naivete is dangerous. So I think what has to be acknowledged is that what they're working with is they're working with architecture within the Alama Mithal, and they're creating a technological interface that opens out into that space. But sooner rather than later, there's got to be an acknowledgement of the inherent existence of the Alama Mithal.
Yeah, wonderful. Actually, that should make the task easier because you don't have to create the metaverse. And since you were mentioned, I brought up Giordano Bruno, and from my exploration of the art of memory, it seems like his quest was, and my understanding is quite superficial. His quest more was to traverse the Alamul Metal through, if device is a correct name, to create a device that would do that. And so, a question there would be is that he was saying that somehow the psyche has to be organized in this, and that organization brings back this connection to the different realms.
Yeah, yeah, and he was working with the idea of the human as a microcosm of the macrocosm, and the Hermetic aim is to actuate the microcosm so that it fully realizes and expresses the potentialities in the macrocosm that are inherent in the microcosm, but not yet realized and not yet, let's say, lined up with the surrounding environment, so that there's a dynamism that occurs when the earth in you resonates with, comes alive in contact with the earth of the planet. The water in you awakens to the flow of the rivers and the oceans. The fire in you is awake to its consanguinity with the magma pulsing underground and the flares of the solar fire. And your whole anatomy realizes itself within the cosmos, and the cosmos realizes itself in your anatomy. And this is not only happening physically, it's happening mentally in the Alam al-Mithal. So that actualization of potentialities means that within us, the cosmos is emerging into its own self-awareness.
Wow. Yeah, that has very deep technological ramifications as well, if that's accepted. I wonder if that was more embodied, we are perhaps once again entering into an age of an alchemical technological era where there's a confluence of both the Hermetic tradition and the objective exploration.
That's right. And, not everyone really understands what's at the heart of alchemy or Hermetic science. And so, the notion of science moving in the direction of alchemy could, sound to some as a kind of return to an outmoded preliminary draft of science and a retreat into irrationality, and that wouldn't be a welcome move. But what has to be understood is that the shift that we're talking about essentially would consist of an acknowledgement of the role of the observer, the place of the scientist in the experiment, and that consciousness isn't something that you can divorce from the experiment, from the investigation. Instead, you are, as the observer, fully party to what you are effectuating in the study, and you are affected by it. And in fact, the universe itself is undertaking the unfolding path of discovery that you know, attribute to your own laboratory. And so that larger framework of self-awareness, but not self-awareness confined to a socially constructed egoic identity, self-awareness that opens out into a multi-layered participation within the cosmic unfoldment, grounded in the divine imperative to reveal the hidden beauty. That reorientation would allow science to become a truly hermetic science, a truly prophetic science, a sister to the revelation that has brought us the sacred traditions of the world.
Yes, thank you. I wish I had heard that 20 years ago. It's this brilliant exposition. I think that the younger generation is very open to this message, and I'm very optimistic personally about this potential that you're speaking of. Earlier, you were talking about the metaverse. We were talking about plugging into the metaverse, and it just occurred to me that in a new generation of technologies, and I know very little about it, quantum computers. I think one of the differences potentially could be that you are the multiverse that they are tapping into is the what they call the 0 point field, or the field from which particles are emerging. And so I've heard some quantum physicists say that that is the real internet web or internet.
Yeah. Yeah, and I think that that's what Ibn Sina was hinting at in speaking of the Alam al-Mithal transpiring in the stars.
Is the Alam al-Mithal somewhat similar to what we call the Platonic dimension, Platonic realm?
Well, you know, the Alam al-Mithal itself has its domains. It's not homogeneous. And there's a zone of the Alam al-Mithal which is close to the etheric world, which is the subtle energetic dimension of the physical world. So there's one dimension, let's say, space within the Alam al-Mithal that comes very close to manifestation, and this is active in the psychosomatic interface between emotion and biomarkers. There's that influence of psychic condition on heartbeat, respiration rate, secretion of hormones, and so forth. So it's right there at that interface between the physical and the subjective mental component of our experience. So there's one component of the Alam al-Mithal that you could say is very close to the physical, etheric physical. And then there's another region which is closer to the angelic world. And so and you experience all of this in meditation. You also experience it in sleep. There's the hypnagogic space where apparitions appear and disappear. There's the dream state where stories unfold, and then there's that deep sleep, which is beyond form. So that's where you're entering into the angelic world. And there's a zone just at the boundary between the angelic world and and Malakut. And that's where certain divine qualities are just beginning to express themselves in the geography of the universe, and they have at that level a very primal, a very universal, very essential character before being translated into, let's say um, nature of this particular building and its its contours and its materials and so forth. This building in which we sit has a very particularity about it, having to do with its 100 and some years of history in Richmond. But this building partakes of qualities that transcend this historical arrangement. And the further you go back toward the ineffable, the closer you approach what you might call universals, qualities where they're not yet so definite, they're not enacted, they're not mingled with other qualities in the way that history brings about a continuous weaving of potentialities that are inherent in the inner origin of this universe. There's you could speak of a kind of purity, but I will also balk at that word because it suggests impurity. But rather, instead of contrasting purity with impurity, I would contrast purity with elaboration. There's an elaboration and a intermingling that happens in the course of manifestation. And the further that you go back by turning within, by going into profound inner states, the more there's a kind of disentangling of the constituents of your experience, so that you end up, like at a certain point, first you're just used to meeting this person or that person, but there's a point inwardly where you can meet humanity itself, a human being who is all human beings. And then there's another point where you meet the terrestrial being, which includes in itself not only humans, but all of the angels and plants. And that also becomes one encompassing being. So the further you go back, the further you reach into the sphere of what are called in Sufism the Arbab al-Anwa, the sovereigns of the species, meta beings, beings who are teeming with beings within themselves, and they represent larger communities of life, whole qualities of being in a vaster field. And that's where I think you would get into what are called the Platonic ideas.
And it also seems that since you were earlier using the word endosymbiotic, and when you use the word purity, you were describing it. I was using an analogy that used in the oneness class, which was the interfaces are not clogged. The interfaces are open all the way up and down. Another thing with these beings that you're mentioning, this endosymbiosis also, if we want access to it, seems like we need the mode of invocation, which perhaps is a different. Would you agree to that? It seems like a different way of making that connection with that level.
Yeah, well, by invoking the divine being, you are first of all acknowledging oneness. You are acknowledging that there's one reality without beginning or end, without boundary, without partner. All is in the essence of its pure existence in essential reality. All is endlessly one. So that's the essence of zikr, or the remembering of God. It begins with that, and then and it ends with that. But within the zikr, then there is also the acknowledgement that the one being has given rise to this multiplicity through the act of creation, whether you call that emanation or revelation of the hidden treasure, however you describe the process. From the one comes the many. And Mola Jami says that the unconditioned does not exist without the conditioned, and the conditioned are not formulated without the unconditioned. So where there's one, there will be the manifestation of the many. In the same way that where there's an ocean, there will be wave upon wave. So creation, in the sense, is inevitable. It's intrinsic to the one life revealing itself. And so then you come to the cosmos as the manifestation of that one life. In the hadith, it said the first thing created is the aql. And the aql means the primal intelligence, which is the ruh al-azam, the soul of souls, which is the life of the angelic world in its totality, the light that lights up the whole of Jabarut, the soul of souls. And then that soul of souls gives rise to the mind of minds, the nafsikul, which in turn gives rise through the act of creation, divine creation, to the body of the universe, which is the jismikul. So then we see that the universe has a soul, has a mind, has a body, and it's all a unitary reality that is instantiated, is incarnated in this kind of crystallization, or to choose another word, you could say that it's bodied forth through an endosymbiosis in which a hollow biont comes into view. So from that perspective, we look out on the universe, we invoke the totality around us, and that attunes us to find our own wholeness, because the cosmos is whole. It's a sum of soul, mind, and body that we see, oh, the soul of the universe is calling me to find my own soul in conjunction with the soul of souls, but also in a symbiosis with my mind and my body.
What you just described is the analogy that comes to my mind is fractal, and I don't know if it's an exact analogy, but that every level of reality seems to be a whole.
Yeah, yeah, they're holes within holes within holes. So Arthur Kessler's word is a good word. A holon is a word, that everything is whole in itself, but part of a larger whole.
Mm-hmm. So, Pirja, one of the themes that you've been describing is the history of Hermeticism and Sufism. And I wanted to ask you, you are about to do a program called Inner History. And two things that come to my mind is, one is, in the description, I read the word prophets of our being. And then secondly, the different ages in this history. I was wondering if you could say something to that. I'm also curious if the ages relate with what we normally call yugas in the Indic philosophy.
Well, in Indic philosophy, the yugas are of a longer duration. We are looking here at historical ages that are easier to track. And the Sufi Sheikh Alauddin Simnani observed that within the lataif, within the faculties of subtle perception ranged within the body, that there are prophets. That is to say, the prophets exemplify modes of consciousness that each of these successive organs represents. And he pointed to the location of each of the historical prophets within this system. And in our studies, what we're doing is tracking history through the lifetimes of the prophets and seeing how the message, as they brought it at each juncture, relates to something intrinsic in our own spiritual anatomy. So we learn about our own process of awakening in this time, in this place, through the opening up of these organs, while also seeing how the course of history describes an unfurling of this kind at the collective level.
It seems again that it's that connection of the microcosm and macrocosm. And what I find fascinating is this potential of all these stories that I have heard since as a kid of many of the dear prophets, the potential of actualizing those stations within oneself.
Right. Yeah. Which is, of course, a daunting task. We should not, by any means, make light of the vastness of the consciousness of these beings. It's no small matter to seek to follow in their footsteps. But not to do so would be to miss what they themselves intended for us, which is that they've brought a legacy and it's there for us to enter into and to live.
Yes, thank you so much. Pirzia, I know that we had 2 hours. We've gone a little overboard. I'm so thankful to you for your time and so grateful for all these insights. And I look forward to speaking to you again.
Much thank you, Kenan Azam Khan. It's been a pleasure to speak with you, and I wish you joy and peace and every fulfillment always.
Thank you so much.